Maya slid the fractured gingerbread into the pocket of her apron and felt, for a single breath, as if she were folding a small, private wish into cloth. The kitchen smelled of browned butter and cinnamon. Steam from a pot of cranberry compote made the room shimmer like a photograph. At the far end of the marble counter, a row of silver domes lined up like sentries. The mansion's heart beat in polished rhythm. Orders called, trays gliding, casseroles found and lost beneath the hands of a dozen hired and hourly lives. And Maya moved inside that rhythm the way a sparrow moves through wind. She did not plan to take the cookie. It had been hastily placed under a napkin, imperfect and cracked, the edge sugared with powdered sugar that looked like snow. She imagined the bite would mean more to Eli than to the banker who ordered the tray, the crispness against his teeth, the laugh it would get from him when he crushed the broken piece between his small palms. He loved gingerbread with his milk, loved the way she made the house smell like a story on Sundays. She had wrapped the cookie in a napkin, then in a dish towel, then tucked it flat in the pocket of her apron where lint and loose chain and the small folded photograph of Eli lived. In the mansion's kitchen, those private economies, small furtive acts of care, were the only rebellions she could afford. The staff were invisible until something went wrong, until a napkin fell off a tray or the silver grew dull beneath a guest's stare. That evening, everyone moved like clockwork. The house buzzed with pre-Christmas orders, and there was a brightness in the dining room. Lights, ornaments, a music box that played a tune the guests pretended to remember. Maya's hands worked as if by muscle memory. She braided brioche, iced a dozen small pies, and checked the oven door twice to get the timing right for Eli's favorite pancakes, which she would carry home at dawn wrapped in a cotton towel. "You're not taking it," said the woman with the perfect posture and gloves that were never warm, the head housekeeper. Lucille's voice had a company of its own. It could call you into a room or dismiss you from the same place. Lucille saw things. She saw crumbs on a shirt, a hair tucked behind an ear, the way the staff moved when no guest watched. Maya froze. Her knee bumped the island. The napkin rustled. Lucille's eyes narrowed like a blade. "You don't take from the table," Lucille said. It was not only instruction, it was accusation made formal, broadcast to the room. Maya swallowed. "It's for my—" She stopped. The word son felt too soft in that room of crystal and order. It sounded like pleading. A dozen hands kept moving around them, the clatter of pans a kind of indifferent applause. Lucille didn't speak softly. She stepped forward, and her shoulder brushed Maya's with a force meant to displace. And in that shove, Maya's shin caught the corner of a prep table, and the world steeped into a white burst of hot pain. For the length of a breath, she saw the floor up close, the tiles' chipped edge, a smear of sauce, the silver trays like moons drifting overhead. Nobody ran, no one broke rhythm. Maya's knees buckled until the counter's edge caught her waist. The gingerbread shifted in her pocket. She felt the napkin dampen slightly with sweat. Lucille leaned down, her jaw tight. "Do better," she snapped, as if insult could be a broom. Maya folded herself into the staff corridor, where the hum of appliances faded into a quieter world of lockers and small personal things pressed against cement lockers, like the boats of other people's lives. She pressed her palm into the back of her leg and tasted iron where the blood had flared, and she did one of the things she'd been taught. Breathe, name the pain, keep moving, because work did not forgive breaks. She heard a voice then, soft, the kind that comes without announcement and knows the shape of a room. It was not Lucille's. It was the sound of the master's footfall across the polished floor, the sound of a man walking where he routinely did not belong, into the space between staff and service. Tobias Hartman had a presence like light reflected off water, sharp, bright, distant. His steps softened as he entered the hallway, and his gaze found Maya as if drawn by a thread. She was not aware of having made a sound at first. Maybe it was a small stifled breath. Maybe it was the soft whimper that mothers seldom let out in front of anyone but the night. What she did know was that Tobias's head tipped, the way it did when a problem landed in front of him and he set it on the ledger in his mind. He had left the dinner room because he had been restless. Some people get restless when their parties are perfect. They look for the part that is not. Tonight his eye fell on what he did not usually see, the gap between the house's gloss and the people who made it. Maya tried to stand straighter, to make herself smaller, as she had learned to do when being seen could be costly. Lucille's voice was still in the doorway. "We have rules," she said. Maya, kneeling in the corridor shadow, kept the gingerbread hidden.
pressed to her hip as if to protect it from both shame and hunger. Her cheek was damp where a small bloom of tears had run. When she dared, all she could whisper was a thing so simple it made the air go thin. I wish we could spend Christmas together. Just one meal." It was a private thing, an ember flung toward no one. The hallway leaned with the air of many secrets. Tobias listened. He was a man for whom many things required calculation, but listening is not always calculable. He stood an extra heartbeat and did not ask to be told more. He could have kept walking, could have returned to the warmth of the dining room and the clink of glass, where disappointments are smoothed like forks on plates.
Instead, he watched the way Maya folded her fingers around a napkin, the way her mouth shaped the word wish, and something inside him collected the light of that small, fragile want. He made a decision. It was an uncomplicated one. He would intervene, quietly, without spectacle. The household ran on layers of order and discretion. He would honor that. He left the corridor with the sound of his coat, with the soft click of his heels on marble, the same way a person leaves a storm, straightening their coat. Shortly after, as night pressed the mansion like a lid, a small envelope appeared beneath Maya's locker. There was no flourish. The envelope was plain, like the ones that carried bills and notes that needed no ceremony. Inside, a white card with a short, unobtrusive note, 2 weeks paid leave, a town car to take her home, a number someone would call to arrange a ride, a phone, prepaid, the kind that came with space for the first message to be the most important one, rested beside it, battery half full, awaiting a life it might enable. Maya turned the card over in her hands as if to find fault, as if a misprint might reveal some catch. There was no catch written there, just a line offering time and a word of instruction. Call this number for arrangements. She folded the card and slipped it into the pocket that already held the gingerbread. Her hands shook, not from fear now, but from something named relief. It was not a salvation. She would not mistake it for that. But the envelope had liberated a narrow corridor through which she could step. She breathed, and the hallway seemed to exhale with her. Outside, the night in Savannah was raw and bright, the stars sharp as coins. A town car waited by the staff entrance of the mansion, a mid-sized vehicle with neutral upholstery and a driver who introduced himself as Patrick with a polite nod and no questions. He closed the door for her with the kind of attention that is itself a courtesy, and for a while the only sound was warmth and the soft run of the heater. The city scrolled by, high-rises, a hotel with a neon sign, a grocery lit like an altar. Maya kept her hands on her apron, on the napkin with the cookie, as if feeling the outline of that tiny treat would anchor the realness of the night. She called Eli as the car moved through the city. His voice came light as glass, a staccato of 5-year-old news. "Mama, did you make pancakes? Did you, he inhaled, as if to make sure each question had space. "Did you bring my gingerbread?" She could hear Lorraine in the background, her mother, telling someone to hold a pot, to wrap a loaf. Lorraine's voice was warm and pragmatic, the kind that had kept the family steady during nights of rent notices and repaired coats. "Eli," Lorraine said into the phone, "Maya's on her way. Sit near the stove, but don't touch anything hot, you hear?" There was a pause, and then the small, frank rejoicing that only a child can manage. "Okay, I'll watch," Eli announced, like a promise. The car slid into the driveway of the bungalow where Maya lived with Eli and Lorraine, a modest, weathered house, halved by mailboxes and the soft chow of neighborhood dogs. It smelled of wood smoke and the good largesse of someone who bakes because they can't afford to let food go to waste. Maya felt herself exhale as she stepped from the car, and the night wrapped around her like a shawl. Eli barreled into her arms before she could set the gingerbread down. He smelled of soap and the kind of clean that childhood keeps, a mixture of whatever cereal holds, a trace of playground dust. He counterbalanced the world for her. In his arms she found the proof of what she had braved. "You were gone for a long time," he said, without accusation, only fact. "It's all right," Maya murmured into his hair. "I'm here." Lorraine had made pancakes and a thin cornbread for the two of them. They ate at a small wooden table that had a nick on its leg where Eli had once tried to count the years from one mark to another. The gingerbread went to Eli last. He broke it into halves, the way a child gives, and fed Maya the first bite, as if the gesture itself could absolve her of being somewhere else that night. The morning after the night that bit like a small knife, Maya went to the clinic. The doctor, with a gentle, unhurried voice, said the thing she already suspected, a hairline fracture. "You'll need to be careful," he said, wrapping a soft brace around her leg. The word fracture sounded easy and terrible in the same breath.
It meant she would be okay if she took time to be so, and it meant there would be pain and bills and likely explanations to managers, to temp agencies, to the next employer who might ask why she had missed a shift. Maya put the brace under her jeans and did that measure that single mothers do. See all the numbers and then choose which ones will be worn like armor. She called the number the envelope had listed. It was answered by a voice that was efficient and toned to courtesy. They arranged for the driver to pick her up on a week that a scheduled repair had already been penciled in. 2 weeks' pay was deposited into her account before she could arrive home. The small phone had 3 messages that day, one of them Tobias's, brief and careful. He left a message that was not grand. "I heard," he said. "Take the time you need. I'll arrange transport." There was so much in that small phrase that did not belong to a man with money and management. The assumption that a worker might have had neither the time nor the permission for rest. The willingness to provide without spectacle. Maya listened to the message twice, not because she was uncertain, but because her fingers needed to hold the sensation of being seen. Lorraine, practical, made pancakes and tucked a clean sweater into Maya's bag. "You can't let anybody tell you it's your fault," she said, pressing a napkin into Maya's palm.
People will behave like hogs, Maya. You don't have to be small for them to be large. It was a piece of parenthood and survival that Maya carried like a pocket-sized map. It reminded her of the rules she would keep for herself going forward. Do the job well, be clear about what you can and cannot do, and never let shame be the currency with which someone else buys your quiet. The days of paid leave gave her something she had not expected, a moment to breathe that did not feel like a debt owed to someone. She watched Eli grow louder in the kitchen, watched him learn to pour milk without overfilling, learned that he could butter the toast without gluing slices together. Lorraine talked to her about small plans, a repairman who could fix a leak in the shed, a city program that sometimes had food assistance in December. They measured hope in thrift store coats and neighborly favors. On the 6th day, an envelope arrived that did not feel like charity. It felt like an offer. Tobias's assistant had left it at the door with a note that read, "A conversation. If you're willing, we'd like to invite you to the Savannah office to discuss a supervisory position, daytime hours, benefits, and a living wage. No strings, just a role." Maya sat on the step and let the paper lie in her lap. The stair creaked under the weight of thought. She imagined what a supervisory position would mean. A desk of her own, a nameplate perhaps with her name, the dignity of leaving work at work and showing Eli she could be both a mother and a professional. She also heard the whisper that had started in the kitchen, the memory of Lucille's hand and the bruise like a question beneath her skin. She knew the stories usually told in Manhattan, of power that makes bargains of helplessness, of money that buys silence. She also knew, from a life without flash, the smell of people who meant what they said. Maya did not take the envelope upstairs to consult anyone as if it were a prize or a punishment. She carried it to the kitchen table as if it were a new ingredient and called Lorraine to sit with her. "What do you think?" Maya asked. Lorraine folded the letter and examined it like a person assesses a tool. "You don't owe anyone your gratitude for being offered work that pays," she said plainly, "but you also don't owe anyone the right to decide how much you can hold. If this gives you regular hours and you can be home at night, it would be different." Maya's voice held the small tremor of possibility. "I could be home every night for Eli. I could—" She stopped. The silence was a cocktail of fear and want. She had labored at the mansion for years because it was reliable, and because it allowed her mornings to make pancakes and evenings to read under the lamp to Eli. But reliability had come with cost, the erasure of small dignities, the way people at dinner tables never met her eyes. "Take the conversation," Lorraine advised. "Ask questions. Don't let anyone talk you out of what you need. You decide what's right for you." Maya folded the letter and slid it into the pocket of her coat. The gingerbread was long gone. That small, private wish had been eaten by Eli with the sound of a thimble of ordinary magic. But wishes can reroute themselves. This one, the one she had whispered in the corridor, had been heard. That did not mean it would be honored in the way she wanted, only that something had listened and acted. Listening was not the same as fixing. Tobias, in the weeks after the corridor, did the quiet things that men with resources can do without spectacle. He asked the household manager for a brief review of staffing structures, inquired about daytime opportunities in Savannah operations, and then shelved the matter to wait for Maya's choice. For a man accustomed to building entire wings of hospitals and donating to names that would glow on marble plaques, his movements were small and careful. It is an odd thing to watch power learn to be gentle. He did not send invitations that shimmered with fate. He sent an assistant to drop a card.
He asked for a meeting in Savannah at a neutral place, a small office from which regional operations were run. The message said, succinctly, "We have been discussing a supervisory role. If you are interested, we would like to talk details." Maya showed up for the first meeting dressed in sensible shoes, her arm a little stiff from the brace, her face made of practiced calm. She left Eli with Lorraine and stepped into a building whose lobby smelled faintly of polish and the kind of lemon that belonged to offices. A receptionist greeted her with that professional warmth that is trained like an instrument's tone. She waited in a chair that had a modest fraying at the arm. People in suits passed and did not notice her, like weather that moves across an arena. Maya felt the old moth in her chest, the one that told you not to expect things to be for you. The interview room was small and had a window that looked onto a tidy courtyard. A plant leaned toward the light as if curious. Tobias listened more than he spoke at first. He asked practical questions, ones that did not condescend. "How would you run a team?" he asked. "What are the boundaries you would set? How long have you done this work?" Maya answered with the authority of someone who had kept a house through storms. She spoke of checklists and of the quiet rituals that keep an operation from tipping, of how important it is that staff have access to benefits and predictable hours so they can be present in their own lives. She spoke about Eli often and without apology. It was part of the geometry of her decisions. The room shifted when she mentioned him. Tobias watched the way her jaw tightened when she explained the time she had stayed late because of someone else's error, when she described how invisible labor is rarely insured by sympathy. It was a careful hour.
She asked questions of her own. What kind of oversight would she have? How much input in hiring? Would she be expected to act as an enforcer of rules that felt punitive? Tobias answered with a restraint she respected. The offer, if it came, would be structured. A daytime role, supervisory responsibilities, benefits. No obligations beyond the job description, no attempts at shaping her life outside of work. Maya left the building and walked back into a Savannah afternoon that held a chill and the smell of dried leaves. She folded the letter into her hand and thought of the gingerbread, of the moment in the corridor when she had whispered something too private for a lobby and a billionaire had heard it. She felt a small, private thing that was both dangerous and rare. Hope. She did not imagine a fairy tale where someone else's money remade everything. She had never needed to be remade. She needed the scaffolding to do the building she already knew how to do. That was the difference she kept returning to. Tobias could offer opportunities. She would do the work. That line, drawn across the center of what she was willing to take, would determine the shape of everything that followed. For the first time in years, she let herself dream about a kitchen table that did not have a schedule stapled to it, about Eli's pajamas staying unwrinkled because she would not be exhausted at midnight, about a desk where her nameplate could sit in the small pride of being visible. The envelope with the invitation felt like a hinge. She could open a door on something new, or she could close it and return to the familiar rhythms that had kept them afloat. When she stepped off the curb, a delivery truck let out a squeal, and the world reordered itself into small acts of kindness. A neighbor offering an extra bag of spinach without fanfare, Lorraine asking if she needed a hand with stockings. The city was a collage of small mercies. At home, Eli announced he had made a list for Santa that included a red truck with a ladder and 1,000,000 pancakes, which made them both laugh. Maya made pancakes anyway and tucked an extra one into Eli's lunchbox the next morning. The brace was snug under her jeans. The staff's envelope remained folded in a drawer. She did not call Tobias right away. She sat with the letter and with the choices and let the edges of each possibility settle. It was the kind of deliberation she had taught herself. Measure the risk, hold the boundaries, ask the hard questions. She would not allow gratitude to be a leash. A week after the meeting, an email arrived with a formal offer for the supervisory position, in clear, simple language: daytime hours, living wage, benefits, relocation assistance for transport, and a note that the leadership expected her to have autonomy in hiring and scheduling. It included an invitation to a pre-start mentorship module, a pilot program Tobias's office was supporting as part of a small initiative to create dignified pathways for domestic workers. Maya read the document in the kitchen doorway, with the afternoon light leaning like a hand on her shoulder. The numbers were manageable, the hours plausible, the benefits meaning that Eli could see a pediatrician without her counting pennies. She imagined what a year would look like with this scaffold. Not rescue, but structure. Not a miracle, but a system of choices. Her chest opened with a feeling like a door unlatching. Still, there was the ache of that shove. There was the memory of Lucille's eye, and the small library of indignities she had kept stacked like plates. There were 1,000 small things that weighed against one new envelope. She remembered the rule her mother had given her. You can accept help, but you must never be owned by it. She went to Lorraine and asked,
If you were me, what would you do? Lorraine, who had labored nights on sewing machines and days at the deli, who had kept a small jar labeled Grace on the counter for change, looked at the letter and then at Maya. She thought about grandchildren and about the way doors had opened for her in small city churches and job boards and strangers with kind eyes. Her voice was steady. You go in and you set the terms, she said. If they want to help, they will respect the terms. And if they don't, you walk away and make your own. But don't shut the door because someone else's life is messy. Maya made a list that evening. On one side, questions to ask, hiring authority, scope of supervision, training budgets, and the nature of the mentorship. On the other side, her non-negotiables, home by dinner, no after-hours calls unless a true emergency, full benefits for part-time staff, and a commitment to pay scales that did not hide overtime. It occurred to her that what she most feared was not that Tobias meant ill, but that a role offered by someone with power could be something that rearranged her life without asking for consent. She wanted to be the architect of her choices. She would not be an ornament on someone else's shelf. When she called the number to accept the interview for the next week's orientation, she did so on her terms. She asked to see a position description. She asked to meet the person who would be her immediate supervisor. The assistant, efficient, again, said they would send a packet. Tobias did not call every day. He sent a short note in reply to her questions. Bring your questions, we'll answer them. We want this to be something built with you, not for you. The smallness of that sentence steadied her. It was a start. On the day she was scheduled to visit the office again, she folded the envelope into her palm like a talisman and walked into a city that had the thin, cold smell of December.
The parking lot for the regional office was full of ordinary cars patched with bumper stickers and groceries. A woman at a nearby vendor stall sold roasted chestnuts and called softly to people who walked by. Maya bought one and kept it warm in her glove. When she stepped into the elevator, she noticed the reflection of herself in the polished metal, the brace under her jeans, the slight limp she favored when she thought no one was looking, a woman who carried the shape of 1,000 small reckonings. She breathed and felt the day hold her like an audience waiting with gentle curiosity. There was a polite man at the reception desk who escorted her to a conference room where several people sat, an HR director with soft eyes, a regional manager who smiled when she said good morning, and Tobias, who arrived late and gave the room the kind of silence that makes a conversation start anew. He greeted her without fanfare. He did not kneel or preen. He sat, and when he spoke, it was with a clarity that did not need to command. They walked through the position description together, the staff size she would oversee, the budget lines, the schedules, the training modules they proposed to fund, and an expectation that she would be an advocate for people whose labor kept many households functioning. There were meetings to attend, yes, but there was also latitude in hiring, and there was a stipend for a mentorship pilot she would design. Tobias listened when she proposed a component she thought essential, childcare during training, because people could not be expected to learn new skills while minding toddlers in cramped spaces. Fund it, Tobias said simply when she explained. If you build something that works, we'll look to scale it. Maya heard in his voice the thing she had felt in the corridor, an inclination toward doing rather than performing. But an inclination is nothing without follow-through. She asked for guarantees, an independent budget line, an advisory board with community representation, a transparent hiring policy. The people in the room exchanged looks that said they had not expected her to ask for these things, but Tobias nodded. We'll make this accountable, he agreed. Not because I say so, but because you will oversee it. Maya signed some preliminary papers that afternoon. The language was measured and prosaic, and between clauses she felt the quieter architecture she had been missing, a professional footing, a chance to teach others what she had learned by necessity. She walked out into the courtyard and thought of all the women who changed bedsheets and folded shirts and never had the chance to build the things they held inside. That night she called Lorraine and told her the long and short of it. Lorraine clapped into the phone the way a woman applauds good small fortune. We'll keep the jar for Gracefuller, she said. We'll say prayers that mean action. Eli overheard random bits. Are you going to have a big desk, Mama? He asked once, suspicious and approving. Maya laughed. Maybe a small desk, she said, but it will be the one I pick. Still, there was a lingering human caution, a line between the gratitude she felt and the autonomy she would guard. Tobias had made a move, yes, he had not been silent, but power can be like sugar. It can brighten the moment and rot the root if it is used to cover neglect rather than correct it. Maya's mind went to the women at the mansion she had helped train, to those who had never been asked what they wanted from a job besides wages. She thought of people whose labor sustains whole houses and lives and is rewarded with little more than the nod of a guest who sees a polished table but not the hands that made it gleam. On a cold morning, a week after the orientation, Maya received a small wrapped package at her door. Inside was a jar of preserves and a card that read in brittle black script, "For the kitchen that keeps the world warm." There was no signature. She thought of the corridor and the gingerbread, and she thought of the envelope and the town car and the phone. To be noticed is not always to be heard, but to be heard and then invited to shape the work that affects you, that was different. It meant a seat at the table instead of crumbs on the floor. She kept calling to herself the rules she had crafted: set the terms, hold the boundaries, ask the hard questions. She would not accept a rule that asked her to be grateful for smallness. She would not be rescued into an existence where her voice was replaced by someone else's idea of her best interest. On the way to the clinic one afternoon, an appointment to check the little fracture now steadying, she found herself looking at the small, faded ornament that had hung by the window in the Savannah kitchen for years. Eli had made it with glitter and glue when he was 3, and the edge had yellowed with the sun. It seemed ridiculous to paste so much meaning into a scrap of paper and tin, yet it held a light, something that could be placed onto a table and illuminate. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the folded offer again. The driving question in Maya's mind was not whether she deserved something better. She had always deserved better. The quiet question was whether the better fit with what she wanted to build, for Eli to have continuity, for other women like her to have dignity, for the program she imagined, a place where domestic workers could learn managerial skills, financial literacy, and leadership, to be sustainable and not a one-off gesture. On the corner by the clinic, a small boy lost a balloon into the air, and it sailed like a pink punctuation. Maya watched it float and thought of wishes. Some are given away, some are kept, some are heard and returned in new shapes. She straightened the strap of her bag and got out of the car, ready to make what would be, for now, careful choices. A message waited in her phone when she returned home that afternoon. It was from Tobias, brief as his other communications had been, but with a line that made her skin prickle in a way beyond the residual bruise. "If you're open to it," the message said, "we'd like to fund a pilot program you design. Not to take control, but to give new leaders chance to lead. We can meet next week and talk budgets. If you decline, we'll find another model, but I hope you'll come." Maya read it 3 times, like reading a map whose lines she needed to learn. She repinned boundaries in her mind. This would be a partnership, not a proprietorship. She would not be made small for anyone's comfort. The word pilot suggested an experiment, a possibility to be corrected and honed. It might fail. It might succeed. It was invited risk. She walked slowly to the window and looked at Eli drawing ships with crayons. He did not look up. His small hand worked with the intent of someone determined to make an order of the world. The line of his hair caught the light. Maya's fingers tightened on the phone. She could see the future in fragments. A rundown building buffed back into life as a center with small classrooms, a little kitchen where women learned catering as a business, a childcare corner so women could attend classes without fear. Jamira's face, one of the women she had mentored briefly at a neighborhood center, flashed in her mind, her voice steady with need. So many hands to be taught how to make theirs count. She was also aware of the watch of the mansion and the hush of its corridors. Lucille remained a figure in the periphery, a woman who had pushed her once and who might resent being asked to change. There would be inevitable friction. Maya had to plan for it. The envelope and the town car had opened a corridor. Maya would not be swept through it. She would step through with a map and a boundary, and the small, stubborn dignity of someone who has fed a child on pennies and then taught themselves how to count to new sums. The next week, an email arrived setting a time to meet. It proposed that they discuss the pilot in a room at the city library, where community meetings were held, public, accessible, neutral. It felt right. Tobias offered to fund childcare during the meeting and to provide a small stipend for travel. The language of the proposal was startling in its clarity: measurable outcomes, an advisory board made up of community members and domestic workers, and an explicit clause about agency. The clause read, "Design decisions to be led by the pilot director." Maya read those words and felt the first tremor of exhilaration that comes when the world finally names you as an author of your own life. She answered with a simple acceptance. She made a list of people to invite. Jamira was the first name she wrote down. That night, before she slept, she crawled into Eli's bed and watched him breathe. The light from the street lamp traced the outline of his small nose and the shadow of his lashes. When he woke, he would ask her for more pancakes and for extra crumbs. She kissed his forehead and whispered something like a prayer that made no promises but asked that she be strong enough to keep the terms she had set. Some people might read the headline, "Caught by a Billionaire," and imagine a man who ensnared women with money and decreed their futures. That was not the shape of what had happened. He had caught a whisper, yes. He had used his means in a manner that lets someone go home for the first time in memory. But the story that would be written across the months to come depended on how Maya held that moment. Would it become a rope or a runway? Would she be shifted into a role whose threads were already stitched into someone else's pattern, or whether it would be a space she could cut and sew herself? She chose to treat it like work. Draft the plan, call the people, make the lists. That was how she had survived so far, one checklist after another, one small victory stacked onto the next. The pilot needed structure, so she drew it with the precision of someone who had learned to time a roast so a child could eat hot food and still make the school pickup. The library meeting was bright and full of the low clack of community life. Two women in coats arguing quietly about a bake sale by the door, a man nodding off with a paper in his lap, the librarian sliding a stack of flyers across the desk. Tobias arrived with an unobtrusive presence, an operative distance between him and the room, and he left the circle in Maya's hands as if that distance were intentional. He asked few questions. When he spoke, he framed budgets and constraints with a clarity that kept people from mistaking generosity for fog. Jamira came, first name on Maya's list, tall, blunt, threading hope through a voice that had seen a dozen dead-end trainings. A handful of other women arrived with histories that mirrored Maya's, housekeepers, nannies, part-time caregivers who worked night shifts at thrift stores. They sat in a circle on folding chairs that seemed too small for so much backstory, and Maya felt the weight of 1,000 small refusals in the tilt of their shoulders. The plan they sketched that night was simple and fierce in its practicality. 6-week modules, childcare provided during class hours, a living stipend for participants so that attendance would not mean hunger at home, financial literacy classes that began with the basics, how to read a paycheck, how to track hours, what overtime actually means, leadership labs where women practice giving instructions, running a small team in a simulated home, and handling conflict without shame. Job placement followed by mentorship pairing, someone who had been there to hold the hand for the first week, then step back as confidence grew. There were objections.
A city official warned about sustainability and asked how they would prove outcomes. A neighbor asked if this was charity or work. Maya answered them all with pedagogy born of a life spent explaining invisible labor in visible terms. Outcomes matter, she said, but outcomes are more than a spreadsheet. They are people who can pay a bill without borrowing a fistful of change. They are children who see their mothers come home when the sun is still in the sky. She kept the language plain. She would not let poetry be used in place of payroll. Tobias signed an initial grant and then stepped back to let the pilot breathe. He did not sign the curriculum. He signed the promise that there would be a budget line and accountability measures. He insisted, largely at Maya's insistence, that an advisory board include community members and at least 2 people who were or had been domestic workers. He asked for quarterly reviews and an independent auditor. That single insistence, on checks and on a public advisory board, was the kind of restraint that proved his interest was not in image, but in impact. The first cohort began in January, under rattling rain and a wind that pried the signs off lampposts. Maya stood in the doorway of the rented room and watched women come with clipboards, children in tow, with jackets buttoned wrong and shoes patched with hope. She welcomed them by the sound of each woman's name into the room. Names matter, she had learned. They stick to your face like angels do to children, small presences that insist on recognition. She taught the first lessons like someone who had kept house against weather and waves, pacing work, reading a contract, the dignity of time clocks. Jamira arrived early every day, a small notebook filling with ambitions. A woman named Rosa, who could iron a shirt so it looked like armor, revealed a seamstress's instinct that could be taught into a small tailoring business. Another woman, Tessa, had an uncanny ability to soothe toddlers, and an honest dislike for the way training programs she'd attended had left her with hope and no plan. They were practical classes and tender hours. Maya learned to ask questions not just about job skills, but about the burdens that kept women away from success. Transportation, sick days, child illness, the casual extra tasks that employers assigned without pay. She pushed back against the petty demands that had once been routine. She taught the cohort how to negotiate a timesheet, how to insist on breaks, how to propose a simple schedule that included their lives outside the house they cleaned. There were small triumphs that read like domestic miracles. Jamira landed a part-time supervisory role at a boutique hotel after practicing an interview that Maya staged, complete with cruel questions and unhelpful managers. Rosa opened a weekend tailoring stall near the farmer's market and made enough to buy a used sewing machine that hummed like a new heart.
Tessa organized a babysitting rotation that allowed her to attend a certification class. The pilot's first graduation was a tiny, loud thing. Paper caps from a dollar store, cookies donated by neighbors, the proud flattening of shoulders that comes when someone has learned to stand for themselves. Maya spoke at that graduation, and it was the first time she saw the crowd look at her as someone who belonged on stage. She told them not to confuse humility with invisibility. "You are the people who keep homes in order," she said. "You teach beds how to sleep. You deserve order in your own lives." She spoke in a voice roughened by long afternoons and brightened by the certainty of deliverables. Tobias sat in the back, palms flat on his knees, listening not as patron, but as one who had learned the right rhythm of applause, slow, steady, and respectful. News of the pilot traveled in the neighborhood like a thank you note passed hand to hand. A local paper ran a short piece that called Maya a leader emerging from unlikely places. A city council member called to ask if this model could be considered in a workforce grant. A regional nonprofit asked Maya to bring a panel to a summit in Atlanta. Each new invitation was a rung on the ladder she had not designed for herself, but was building deliberately now. And then Lucille applied. The envelope arrived in the stack of intake forms on a wet Thursday. Lucille's name was at the top. Maya read it twice before she let herself feel the first flare of heat in her cheeks, anger wrapped in the memory of a shoved shoulder and a chipped tile. The room in her mind where that corridor had been rose like glass. The advisory board called a meeting. Lucille sat across from Maya with a face that looked older and smaller than she remembered, the edges worn by time. In the room were women who had boiled down their stories to practical sentences, accounts of the hours they worked, the wages they were owed. There were 2 members from the mansion staff who had stayed, hired later under the new supervision protocols, and who offered a cautious witness that Lucille had been the kind of manager who tolerated humiliation. Lucille asked to join because she had been fired and had nowhere else to go, she wrote, because she had family who needed the income, because she regretted how she had acted. Maya listened. She had been raised to believe in hard rules and in the tempering of mercy by accountability. The board's response was not a simple yes or no. It was a process. Lucille was asked to attend a sequence, a restorative circle with those she had wronged, a paid training course on respectful management, a supervised internship where she would not hold full authority, and a public acknowledgement of harm that included financial restitution where appropriate. The terms were clear. Restoration would be conditional and measured. Maya insisted on this because mercy without boundaries can be cruelty disguised as kindness. The restorative circle was small and strange, like a weathered song. Lucille spoke first, voice cracking as she explained how fear had made her cruel. Fear of losing a job, fear of seeing her own weakness, fear that if the staff were treated as equals, the mansion's strict order would dissolve. She said she was sorry, that she had been wrong to put her shame on other bodies. Women who had been her subordinates spoke of nights when they took home half of their wages in cash because someone needed the money. They spoke about apology feels small and prosecutorial. Maya listened and then proposed a structure. Lucille would enter a 6-month supervised placement with clear deliverables and regular audits. She would also attend counseling and management training paid by the pilot fund. If she met benchmarks, consistent behavior change, respectful conflict resolution, documented restitution, then she could be considered for part-time work. If not, the application would be closed. The board voted. It was a slow, careful yes. The arrangement was not healing in the immediate sense. Lucille's presence at the classes was a daily small tension. A woman who once shoved Maya now sat learning about de-escalation and gender pay gaps. The first week, a few of the cohort refused to be in the same room. The second week, some returned when they saw Lucille quietly mop the floor she had once judged without apology. The work of restoration was not dramatic. It was a series of small, repeated acts of accountability, letters of apology that acknowledged specifics, a donation to a fund for staff medical expenses, and most important, a willingness to be supervised and corrected. Maya discovered something about her own mercy in the process. She had every right to keep Lucille out, and there is power in that exactness. But she also recognized that the pilot's success would be measured by how it could change the culture that had permitted shoves. Her choice to offer structured restoration was a leadership move. It taught others how to make employers answerable to ethics. It protected future staff from humiliation by setting a precedent that behavior could be measured and changed. As the pilot expanded, invitations multiplied. Maya was asked to speak at a regional summit in Atlanta and then at a 2-day convening in Chicago. Each trip carried with it attention. Leave Eli or bring him. How to manage childcare without the sleight of hand of borrowed favors. Tobias's office offered to fund travel and childcare, and then took a cautious step back,
making sure the pilot's finances and decisions remained held by Maya and the advisory board. He expressed the offer not as a convenience, but as infrastructure. "Resources are the thing that allows people to use their time," he said once in a text. "I'll provide the runway if you want to fly."
At a conference in Chicago, Maya stood on a stage with fluorescent lights and a hostile-tinged air that lessons to the unpracticed can feel like scrutiny. She spoke with a clarity that surprised even her. Her words were not honeyed, they were practical beams. If you build training without childcare, you are asking women to choose between presence and progress. If you don't structure wages into your model, you are building a dream that only exists in grant reports. We need pay, yes, but we also need dignity, nameplates, sick days, transparent schedules, respect. The audience clapped not with a show of charity, but like people who had been given a list and were relieved to find it in order. A journalist asked about Tobias. How did a billionaire fit into the narrative without making it a rescue story? Maya's reply was succinct. He funded a structure, and then he listened to the people the structure was meant for. If your money teaches people to obey your commands, money is a leash. If your money teaches people to lead, it is a tool. The idea stuck. It became a phrase people used when they spoke about the pilot. Tools, not leashes. It helped reframe conversations about philanthropy and power. Slow romance threaded itself through months like unwinding ribbon, small, purposeful, never hurried. Tobias did not attempt cliché gestures. He did not surprise Maya with extravagant displays. Instead, he offered presence that assumed her agency. He came to a meeting and sat quietly in the back, listened, and then walked up to speak to a woman who had just given a powerful testimony and asked her how he could help scale her idea. He sent an email about logistics rather than a bouquet. He learned to stay his hand when the work of leadership needed to be hers. He delivered a van of supplies for the next cohort and then left, letting the cohort determine how to use them. There were moments that felt like a soft recognition. Once, after a long day of bookkeeping for the pilot, Tobias knocked on Maya's door with takeout. Simple food, no fanfare. They ate at her table, where the Nick leaned on the leg like a memory. Eli invited himself at the table and told Tobias, without gauging the man's privilege, that he liked pancakes better than waffles. Tobias laughed and leaned forward to listen, the sound a small bridge. "Your son has good taste," he said, and Maya felt no bargain in the compliment, only gratitude for the ease of a man who could speak to a child with honesty. They began to speak without scripts. Tobias asked about the challenges of being a single parent. Maya asked him about the discomfort of recognizing a system he had once ignored. They traded small truths. He admitted he had not understood the mechanics of domestic work until he listened. She confessed she still had days when the old shame crept in like drafts. They found a rhythm of candor. He learned to celebrate the small victories. A woman's first paycheck direct deposited into her account. The day a childcare rota functioned without stress. She learned that he could hold his silence when she needed the stage. Not all streams are straight. A reporter from a glossy magazine arrived one afternoon with a headline already drafted in her mind. The billionaire who saved the Maid. The journalist wanted the tidy arc, the whisper in the corridor, the money, the redemption. Maya declined a front-page personal narrative. She refused to let the pilot be framed as a single benevolenter's act. Instead, she invited the reporter to meet the advisory board, the cohort, and community leaders. The article that followed was better than Maya had hoped. It called the model community-led and emphasized the pilot director, her name, over the donor. Small victories include sentences that change how people see labor. There was, too, the practical grind. Funding is never steady. An early funder pulled back mid-year, citing budgetary constraints. The panic that rippled through the advisory board was a raw thing. Payroll needed to be met. A childcare vendor threatened to cancel. Maya wrote 3 grant applications in a week and drove a county administrator to a site visit herself, sweeping a room afterwards with a broom until the floor smelled domestic and honest. She hosted a community bake sale that raised enough to cover a week of stipends. The pilot learned to be resilient by choir singing small economies together. Lucille's progress was slow. She had days when old reflexes returned, snapping at a trainee, a look that made a woman flinch. But then she would call the board and accept correction. She began volunteering time at a local shelter and brought a handwritten note of apology to the clinic where Maya had once been treated for her fracture. Lucille's restitution included financial support for a woman whose injury had led to costly care. It was not a theatrical redemption, there is no such thing, but it was accountability reduced to a ledger. Actions counted as much as words.
The Rise Center, the name the advisory board settled on, started as a derelict pharmacy on a main street that had seen better decades. Its windows were boarded, its signs sagged, and pigeons nested in its eaves. Maya had walked past the building countless times and pictured it with light. Classrooms with sun, a small kitchen for catering classes, a childcare nook lined with soft pillows. Leasing it required negotiation, a landlord hesitant to take a chance on an untested model, a city zoning office that demanded proof of impact. The community rallied. Jamira organized a petition. Rosa hosted a sewing drive for curtains. Tobias wrote a check that covered a large part of the initial renovation, but he did so after the board approved the budgets. Again, a tool, not a leash. Renovation smelled of paint and sawdust, and it felt like making a house new.
Volunteers painted walls in soft, hopeful colors. A retired carpenter volunteered a weekend to build shelves. Maya stood in the midday dust and felt the miracle of ordinary labor. Hands that knew how to fix things, neighbors who brought tools, a small army of people who had been given reasons to believe. The building's skeleton became rooms. A small hand-painted sign, Rise, hung over the door before the official unveiling. It required a yard of nerve to put a simple name on an old stoop and tell everyone it would be theirs. The sign unveiling was neither gaudy nor small. It was a community picnic and a ceremony. Eli ran through the crowd with a paper boat he had made in class, and Lorraine clapped until her hands pinkened. Lucille came and stood in the back, a woman waiting to see if she had earned permission to breathe. Tobias arrived quietly with a purchased wreath for the doorway, and he handed the ribbon to Maya when she asked him to. She tied it with a knot that kept the bow modest. The moment the sign was revealed, someone began to clap, then another person, and it swelled into an applause that felt like a roof being built over a house. At the center of the gathering, Maya made a speech that few expected to be sharp. She spoke about dignity and about the names of women who had taught her how to hold a life together. She spoke of systems and choices. "This place is not my miracle," she said. "It is a set of tools. Tools make things possible. They do not make choices for you. We are the ones who will teach these tools so that doors do not close on our children again." Tobias stood at the edge of the crowd listening. He had watched Maya's speeches in different rooms now, at graduation, at city council hearings, at summits, and each time he learned how to bow and listen without claiming credit. He had also learned by watching her insist on accountability and to keep him grounded. That day, he stepped forward with a simplicity that matched his earlier acts. He proposed a matching fund for the center's first year of operations, contingent on the advisory board approving quarterly audits and community representation in decisions. It was not theater, it was a lender of infrastructure. Then, in a private moment later that evening, with string lights and the smell of cornbread cooling on a table, he asked Maya, quietly, a question about partnership that was both practical and personal. "I want to be your partner in the center," he said. "Not to lead it, to support it, to ensure it has what it needs. I want to help if you'll have me." He looked at her as someone who understood that asking is not owning. Maya felt a complicated warmth in her chest. She had not been waiting for a ring. She had been waiting for the conversation that would make clear that any relationship would be built on mutual respect and equal footing. "If you're asking to be part of the center," she said, "then talk to the board, commit to the audits, sign the terms we made." Work to be accountable. Her voice was steady. She was not negotiating whether to love him. She was negotiating how a partnership would not become a faculty of fate. Their romance moved slowly, like the mending of a fence, measured, practical, and steady. They ate together sometimes, not as an event made to impress, but as two adults who found each other's company restful. Tobias learned when to step back. Maya learned to accept help that did not carry strings. They had arguments about small things, the right shade of paint for an office, whether to accept a media request, but they made decisions as peers. The emotional intimacy built on an ethical ledger, consent, transparency, and the habit of asking, what does this mean for the people who will live with our choices? There were setbacks. A donor once suggested a glossy ad campaign that would be about the billionaire who did good. Maya declined. Tobias had to be convinced to refuse such branding because he initially wanted the center to be known. Maya taught him that modesty amplifies integrity. Another moment came when a trainee accused a facility manager, someone hired from the mansion under new protocols, of favoritism. Maya convened a fast review and reassigned duties pending audit. She set a precedent. No one was beyond questioning. The pilot's models multiplied. A local church offered a satellite room for evening classes. A bakery offered internships for food prep graduates. Graduates of the first cohort, Jamira, Rosa, Tessa, returned as mentors. Maya watched them take to the small lectern with a steadiness that had been learned through experience. The multiplication the board wanted was not only in numbers, it was in the culture of mentorship, those who had been lifted, now lifting others.
The summit in Boston was the place the program entered a new public reckoning. It was an invitation to speak to a room of policymakers and fund managers. Maya agreed to speak, but insisted that members of the original cohort join her on stage. Together, they told stories of real wages, of childcare logistics, and of the small bureaucratic battles one faces when asking an institution to be accountable. When Maya spoke, she did not speak as someone grateful for a savior. She spoke as someone who had repurposed opportunity into platform and then into policy. At the end of the summit, a group of foundations offered a multi-year matching grant. It would allow the Rise Center to hire a full-time operations manager, to install a permanent childcare suite, and to fund a revolving fund for small business startups by graduates. The news arrived via an email that everyone read aloud in the tiny office. There were tears and then a sharp, practical call to action. How to scale without diluting the advisory board's input. How to keep the decision-making close to the people affected. At home that night, Eli asked if they could get a real Christmas tree that year.
It had been a small tradition. They had a wire tree once, a family relic, but a real tree felt like a luxury. Maya smiled and told him that this year they might get a little evergreen, but she added, more importantly, that they would have people at their table and enough soup to go around. Eli demanded pancakes anyway. The pilot had brought with it not only professional satisfaction, but the wider consequence of community repair. Former employers of some graduates began to call and ask for training modules for their staff. Marriages repaired because one partner now had a steady schedule and the language to negotiate domestic labor. A local school reported fewer absences because children's parents could now take daytime classes, find better hours, and be present. Maya's old bruise healed into a thin, pale line, and sometimes during quiet moments she would touch it and remember the corridor whisper. That memory had been a raw hinge. It had opened many doors, some of which required courage to walk through, because she remembered how small a wish could be when spoken, and how it could be heard. Christmas approached with the slow insistence of an old clock. The center organized a small community meal. Everyone was invited. The list of guests was careful: cohort graduates, mentors, a few city officials who had proved themselves steady, Lorraine with her jar for grace, Jamira with a basket of scones, and Lucille with a hand that trembled in apology but which she kept open. Tobias asked if he could bring something. Maya said yes, and gave him a practical request. Bring a table, one that can seat more than you think we need. The Rise Center's kitchen hummed the way any good kitchen should. Hot pans, laughter, the smell of thyme and browned onions. Volunteers moved with familiarity, and sometimes with the excited clumsiness of people who had learned to serve with respect. Eli wore a paper crown he declared to be royalty, and insisted that everyone say what they were grateful for. He thanked the center for teaching his mother things that made her smile, and everyone laughed, because gratitude spoken by a 5-year-old is impossible to resist. The meal was modest: cornbread that Lorraine had insisted on making, a roasted vegetable tray, a pot of soup thick enough to feed pockets of cold, and a small platter of gingerbread cookies that had been made by the center's food prep class. Maya prepared a pancake stack for Eli as a private joke, and he devoured it with the innocent gusto of a child who trusted the world enough to keep on eating. At one point, Lucille approached the table where Maya sat with Tobias. She held out a small folded piece of paper. "I wanted to," she began, voice thin. "I wanted to say thank you for letting me change." It was a clumsy phrase, but it was true. Maya accepted the note, and then, because leadership is always public, she invited Lucille to say a few words. Lucille's apology was halting and real. She spoke of a fear that had taught her to rule by intimidation, and of how learning accountability had been harder than she expected. She told the room that she had been taught by Maya and the board how to keep her hands proper and how to rest them when she was tempted to push. The room accepted the apology with the slow forgiveness of people who value honesty above theatrical atonement. Tobias spoke too, but not as savior. He spoke about the importance of listening, and then stepped back and let Maya lead the center's brief closing ritual. She invited everyone present to place a small candle on a communal table and to say one word they hoped the Rise Center would teach them in the coming year. The words were practical and steeped in desire: steady, dignity, freedom, enough. After candles and songs, when the candles had burned down to stubs and the lights were dimmed, Tobias walked Maya home, not in a town car, but with his coat around her shoulders when the night wind bit. They walked the route past the old pharmacy, where a handful of folding chairs sat stacked for Monday's classes. Eli fell asleep halfway, his head on Tobias's shoulder, breathing in the simple, honest rhythm of sleep. On her porch, Tobias stopped and asked her if she would consider, someday, having dinner more often than at community events.
His voice had the worn edge of someone asking for a small permission rather than ownership. Maya thought of gratefulness and boundaries. She thought of the rules she had set for herself, not to be owned, not to accept help that erased her voice. "Maybe we can do dinner and also go over the board meeting minutes," she joked, and he laughed. He handed her a small wrapped package, practical again. Inside was a small notebook, leather-bound, with multiply stamped on the cover. It was the word they had settled on months ago, the sticky note slogan that had become a mission. "For plans," he said simply. She placed the notebook in her bag and kissed Eli's sleepy forehead. He murmured in his sleep about toast and trucks. Tobias walked back into the night with hands in his pockets and with the way a man keeps from stepping into someone else's light too quickly. Christmas morning arrived as it always did, uneven, bright, and delicious in its small chaos. The Rise Center had hosted a neighborhood breakfast the day before, and a toy drive had stocked a small table with second-hand trucks and dolls. Eli found a red wooden truck that had the dignity of being old and loved. He declared that it was the best truck ever. They ate around the kitchen table as a small family. Lorraine had insisted on dressing the table with a cloth she had embroidered when she was young, a cloth that had survived moves and laundries, and which smelled of the surety of someone who stitches her life together. Lucille sat at the opposite end, a sign of the kind of bravery that must meet accountability with humility.
Jamira and Rosa were there, and a few others from the cohort who had become friends. There was no pomp. There were no marble dishes. There was warmth, a pot of stew, and a pie that had been baked with care. Tobias placed a small wrapped bread on the table with a note that read simply, "For the hands that did the work." He sat at the table, not at its head, and he passed plates, fetching a spoon for a child who asked. When the meal ended, they stepped outside. The Rise Center sign stood above the doorway, a modest thing that read like a promise. There was a short ribbon someone had strung across the stoop in memory of the unveiling. Tobias took Maya's hand and did not ask, "Will you marry me?" He asked instead, "Will you build this with me, your way? Will you let me be someone who helps without taking the reins?" It was smaller than a proposal and larger in consequence. It asked for partnership, for a mutual covenant predicated on equality and consent. Maya looked out at Eli, at Lorraine, at Lucille and Jamira, and the women who had become her colleagues and friends. She thought of all the lists she had made and the boundaries she had kept. She thought of the corridor whisper and the gingerbread that had started everything. She remembered the rules she had written for herself: accept help, but never be owned by it. She turned back to Tobias and saw the man who had learned to be patient, to speak when spoken to fund and then to step aside. "Yes," she said, and the word held 1,000 small clauses, terms and audits and meetings and moments of quiet dinners and fierce protection. It was a yes that contained the phrase, "on equal terms." They agreed then, not to a fantasy of rescue, but to a partnership that would be difficult, demanding, and humane. The year that followed was not a perfect glide. There were audits and staffing headaches and moments when the center's phone rang with needs bigger than the budget. But the meetings began with a check. Did this decision increase dignity? If yes, proceed. If not, step back. They recruited a manager from the pilot's graduates. They set up a scholarship fund. They created an online module for employers about fair scheduling. They won a small municipal contract to provide training for a county shelter. The Rise Center grew into a place of practical hope. On the first anniversary of the pilot, the advisory board organized a small ceremony at the center. A signboard stood in front with a new, measured phrase, "Rise Center, tools, not leashes." They cut a ribbon and then sat down to count the visible things. The number of graduates now employed with benefits, the businesses started, the hours of childcare provided. They counted less visible things too: a mother who could read a contract without terror, a child whose bedtime was steady because a parent had a predictable job. Maya spoke last at the anniversary, looking out at faces she had come to love.
She spoke of memory and of using power responsibly. "We are not trophies for someone else's charity," she said. "We are builders of a community where work is seen and where home is not a place you escape from, but where you return with your whole self." Eli tugged on her sleeve afterward and said in public the kind of thing children always say with beautiful bluntness, "Mama, you are the best Christmas present I ever had." The crowd laughed and someone cried, and Maya felt an ordinary, fierce gratitude wash through her. She had not been saved by a billionaire. She had been noticed by one, and she had turned that notice into scaffolding for a life she and many others could stand on. Christmas the next year was again modest and generous. The table was full. The Rise sign glinted in the morning sun. Tobias stood in the doorway and watched as Maya moved from room to room, administering the final details with a calm he had learned to respect. He did not fix her life with money. He wrote grants and then presented budgets to the board. He made sure that when journalists came, the narrative stayed on the people whose labor mattered. That night, as the center's lights dimmed and the last guests walked home with leftover pies, Maya stood on the stoop and listened to Eli rehearse a carol inside. Lorraine leaned on her shoulder and spoke about small things she wanted her grandchild to have: clothes that fit, a teacher who knew names, a neighborhood with streets that felt safe. Maya thought of the gingerbread pocketed years ago and smiled at the trace of its beginning. The wish had been simple then: one meal, one moment. It had become more than that. It had become a life in which she could choose the terms. Tobias took Maya's hand in a gesture that matched the rhythm they had taught each other. "You were caught," he said quietly, but in the best way. He meant he had caught the whisper in the corridor, and he had been altered. Maya looked at him for a long beat. "Yes," she replied. "I was caught. I chose how to use the rope." They walked inside together, not as a rescue story, but as partners who had learned how to share tools. Eli climbed onto Maya's lap and declared that next year he wanted 1,000,000 pancakes, to which Tobias promised to learn to make pancakes himself. Lorraine pretended not to notice the way Tobias watched Maya, and the way she, in turn, watched the world they were building. Outside, the Rise Center's sign held steady in the night. Lights from nearby windows hummed like a town asleep but stable. It was not an ending so much as a starting line that had become a road, slow, deliberate, and intentionally shared. If someone asked the headline of the whole thing, "Caught by a Billionaire, the Maid's Wish for a Christmas Together," Maya would say, with a smile, that the catching had been a kind of listening.
She would remind them that the wish had been small and ordinary, and that the miracle was not in money, but in being seen and given the means to build a life that honors labor and love alike. If this story touched you, consider subscribing for more stories like this. And if you want to learn more about the Rise Center model or support similar community initiatives, check the link in the description.